to dedicated to late antiquity in the Balkans. For those of you who don't know me, I will present myself briefly. My name is Vassil Tenekejiev. I'm a Bulgarian from Varna on the Black Sea coast. I'm an archaeologist at the Varna Regional Museum of History, the Department of Archaeology. I have a PhD in archaeology, and my major field of interest and expertise is early Christian archaeology, and more broadly speaking, late antique archaeology. What else? My major archaeological site, the one that I have explored since 2007. This is an early Christian monastery located near Varna on Janavara Hill. It is dated in the 5th and 6th century, a very interesting site. There we work with my colleague, Alexander Minchev from the same museum. This is one of the best specialists in early Christian archaeology that I know. So I'm very lucky that I work with him there. And what else? I work also with the Balkan Heritage Foundation. This is a Bulgarian foundation that organizes archaeological field schools, not only in Bulgaria, but in other Balkan countries too. So we work together in the Janavara area. And the foundation also has other scientific projects. And I'm happy to be also part of this scientific group dedicated to the late antiquity. So this is my brief self-presentation. Now I will proceed to the lecture. I will read because otherwise I think I will talk too much. So today the topic of my lecture is the veneration of relics in the early Christian period. To be more specific, I will focus on the archaeological evidence for this practice. Chronologically speaking, I will discuss the period 4th, 6th century AD. The geographical context of my presentation will be the eastern half of the Balkan Peninsula, which during the period formed the administrative unit of the Diocese of Thracia, or Thrace. I will divide my lecture in two parts. In the first of these, I will try to present briefly the variety of repositories for keeping and venerating relics in the early Christian churches in the diocese. Probably some of you would consider such a topic as a bit trivial. I believe, though, that there are very interesting questions concerning the cult of relics, which go far beyond simple typology and are worthy of discussion. Second part will be more specific. I would like to share with you some observations and conclusions of mine that I made while working on my PhD thesis. Long story short, the main question is whether it was mandatory to have relics in every church in the aforementioned chronological and geographical context. Archaeology gives some surprising answers. I hope that this second part of the lecture will become a good starting point for a discussion. In our late antique scientific group, there are specialists in various fields, archaeologists, historians, theologians, etc. And I believe that this gives us a valuable opportunity to see the topic of the veneration of relics from various different perspectives. Holiness is a very complicated theological concept in Christianity. Theology is not my field of expertise. However, I cannot avoid making some very basic notes on this aspect of faith, as they are closely related to the topic of my presentation. I will summarize and list these notes in 5 subsections. First, holiness is always connected with the presence of God's grace, or in other words, God's energy. In fact, holiness is a result of this presence. Second, holiness is something that could concern both spiritual and material world. When we talk about human being, both soul and body. 3. Holiness remains in the saints' bodies even after they have passed away. This is fundamental for the veneration of relics. 4. The whole holiness is present in every part of the saints' bodies, no matter how small these pieces are. This justifies and encourages the practices to disassemble the skeletons of the saints and to keep and venerate the fragments separately, not to mention the rare but still striking cases of dismembering and decomposed bodies of saints. 5. Last but not least, it is believed that holiness could be transferred by touch. This justifies the creation of the so-called secondary relics, also called contact relics. This means relics created by physical contact or by touch. There is a wide variety of secondary relics. The Veil of the Virgin, St. Peter's chains, Column of the Flagellation, Crown of Thorns, and even the Holy Cross itself all belong to this type of relics. This same belief validates the practice to create and distribute, hold on with the pronunciation, eulogies or evlogia. In this context, fluids or objects that have been in physical contact with relics. They are distributed to the faithful as a symbol and material agent of blessing. Hence the term evlogia, ancient Greek for a blessing. Next question that I want to discuss is about terminology concerning the places in early Christian churches where the relics were kept and venerated. The terminology is very inconsistent and confusing. Internationally, the most commonly used term for those repositories is a crypt, from the verb to hide in ancient Greek. It can refer to any kind of underground place for keeping relics, no matter of its shape and or size. There were some attempts, by André Grabar, for example, to reduce the term's meaning to an underground grave, but that has not been widely accepted. Another specific term is confessio, or in Bulgarian we pronounce it confessio. Usually, it refers to constructions that provide an option to get in and to make physical contact with the relics through a kind of entrance, corridor, or at least small opening. This term is not very popular in scientific literature. Two other terms come from ancient Greek and are not much used beyond the studies in Greek. This is unfortunate because they reflect very important aspects of the cult of relics. First of these terms is catathesis. It refers to the small crypts under the altar. It focuses on the act of putting or hiding the relics under the altar table. The second term is enkainion or enkainion. It derives from the ancient Greek verb for to dedicate, in sense of to dedicate the church, for example. The term is especially relevant for the period when the presence of relics became essential for the church dedication. Of course, in some situations, scholars prefer terms that are more general, like, for example, a grave, a tomb, a hypogeum, a vault, or a repository for relics. There are various attempts in scientific literature to make a typology of the early Christian crypts. Most commonly, they use as criteria the layout, the construction, the size, and of course, the location. As an example, I can mention, let's say, the typology of crypts published by Jean-Pierre Soudini in 1981. None of these attempts, however, has provided a universal typology. The problem stems from the fact that early Christian crypts demonstrate a surprisingly big variety of shapes and sizes. This is valid for the Christian worlds of late antiquity in general, and for the territory of the Diocese of Thracia in particular. This observation points to something very specific and important: the impressive diversity in the way the crypts were designed suggests that there was not a standard, nor even a well-established nor even a well-established tradition of how exactly to build a crypt. Probably there were some regional trends, or maybe just some repositories for relics in famous churches were copied because they were considered prestigious prototypes. It seems obvious that some other reasons stood behind the particular design of the crypts. So what might they be? Apparently, it was the specific way the relics repositories had to function that explained their design. Therefore, as a next logical step, we have to investigate the question of how the crypts functioned. Everything began with the celebration of the Christian saints' memory at their graves. From the early 4th century, people started to erect light architectural constructions or even whole buildings. Those were called memoria or martyria at those holy burial sites. Then, in some cases, they were replaced by real churches. At this point, I have to mention two phenomena which had a fundamental impact on the cult of relics. First of them is the relocation of the holy bodies from their original burial sites to churches elsewhere. An important note here: churches that were no longer in the necropoli, but in the cities or in other places not connected with cemeteries. Second of these is a practice which became more and more popular: to distribute bones or pieces of bones from saints' bodies to churches nearby and/or in faraway places. As historian Peter Brown explains eloquently in his studies, the first phenomenon was revolutionary for late antique society. With their theologically justified approach to death and to saints' bodies, Christians broke the existing in pagan cultures unbreakable symbolic barrier between the land of the living, this is the city, and the land of the dead, this is the necropolis. The building of memoria and churches, which were public meeting places, in the cemeteries was the logical next step in this process. Another step further was the transfer of the relics, whole skeletons, bones, or pieces of bones into the cities. Fragmentation of the bones and their distribution was a completely different phase in this big process. I already mentioned the theological background. Apart from it, the main motivation behind this new practice was the need and, of course, the desire of early Christian community to possess a material token for the saint's divine presence in its hometown. Furthermore, the relic should guarantee that the saint would act as an advocate before God on behalf of the local Christians. Distribution of fragments of bones and the idea that they were, in a mystical way, as holy as the whole body resulted in several specifics in the cult of relics. What they had in common was the way they treated the pieces of bones like symbolic substitutes for real bodies. Respectively, the deposition of the relics in the crypt was considered as a kind of a symbolic burial. A very good illustration of all this is the most common shape of the reliquaries, the small boxes for keeping relics, more precisely pieces of bones. These were often in the shape of small sarcophagi. Another question that I want to discuss is about the access to the crypts, respectively to the relics. There are also sub-questions about the reason behind the general decision whether or not to have an access point, and if there is one, about the reasons explaining one versus another type of access to the crypts. If the crypt had an access point, it means that the relics were supposed to be actively used in the religious life of the local Christian congregation. Here we can comment on several options. On certain occasions, clerics could take the relics out from the repository for veneration. That could happen, for example, on the holiday of the saint or on important Christian feasts. In such cases, the relics could be displayed temporarily in the church, on a table, or in some other way. Usually, veneration includes prayers, contemplation, touching, kissing, and also the rite of libation. It consists of ritual pouring of a liquid that could be olive oil, water, or wine on the relics. The liquid would be blessed by the contact with the holy object, and then it could be distributed among the faithful or used in various rites. If we return to the list of options, it should be noted that for some of the ritual activities mentioned, it was not mandatory to take the relics out of the crypt. This is the reason why. First, sometimes repositories for relics were designed to be open regularly. Second, sometimes access was more difficult and used only on special occasions. 3, sometimes it was possible only to see or touch the holy object through some small opening. And 4, sometimes the crypts were devised in such way that a libation could be performed from outside. At this point, we can raise the reasonable questions as to why some crypts were designed without any access to the relics, and how in these situations the relics would be engaged in the religious life of the congregation. First of all, the very presence of relics in the church had an immense importance for local worshippers. Furthermore, very often, the saints' remains, whole or bone fragments, were buried under the altar in a ritual strongly influenced by the Holy Scripture. Most recognizable place is in the book of Revelation, chapter 6, verse 9. And when he had opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for word of God and for the testimony which they held, etc., etc. So this is chapter 6, verse 9. The ideas that metaphorically speaking, the church was built upon the blood and the bones of the saints were so strong and fundamental in Christian culture that they influenced the cult of relics in general, even in cases when the holy bones were in the church but not specifically under the altar table. The presence of relics gradually became so important that it was transformed into a rule, a mandatory requirement for the dedication of a new church. However, when and where this happened is a separate question which will be discussed in a few minutes. And so we can conclude that it was far from obligatory to provide any specific access to the relics. They might well be venerated without direct contact of any kind. Let us now have a look at various examples from the Diocese of Thracia. I have to note that this is just a selection and not a full list of all the crypts in the diocese. Nevertheless, you can find here illustrations of some of the topics already discussed today. We start with the cemetery basilica near Nove, Svishtov, Bulgaria. Here we have an example of a grave under the altar. It is important that the church itself, in this case, is located in the necropolis of the city. You can see the grave in the apse here. And now this is the Episcopal Basilica in Histria, today in Romania. Another grave under the altar. This time, though, the church is in the city. This is the Episcopal Basilica. So we can assume that in this case, the body was transferred from the original burial site to this new place to be venerated in the church. In the Diocese of Thracia, usually the graves or the bigger tombs that contain whole bodies of saints were rare. In some cases, they were under the altar table or nearby. Sometimes, though, they were located elsewhere in the church. In Basilica number 2, near Nicopolis at Nestum, today in Bulgaria, near the town of Gocedelchev, one tomb and 4 graves were placed in a special premise adjacent to the nave. A 5th grave was located very close to them, in the side aisle of the basilica. I have to note that in this case, it is not 100% sure that the tomb and especially the graves belong to saints, but this is a possible hypothesis. Sometimes the crypts had a very sophisticated design and impressive size. A goodly number of crypts like that was discovered in the region of the lower Danube, mostly in the province of Scythia. Basilica in the yard of Mihai Eminescu School in Tomis, Constanța, Romania, is a good example. You can see there 3 chambers for the bodies of apparently 3 saints. In front of them, there is a vestibule, or a kind of vestibule. It is interesting that most of the crypts for whole bodies were in the region of the limes. Those in the inner parts of the diocese are proportionally rare. This can be explained with the fact that in the military border region, persecutions were more numerous and serious, and there were more local martyrs executed and buried there. As for the rest of the diocese, very often we record only small pieces of relics brought from somewhere else. A relatively popular type of crypt was that with a chamber and steps leading down to it. This type of facility is large, but it is not made for a whole body. Those crypts were made for small pieces of relics hidden in small niches in the walls, as you can see on the slide. Here we see 3 examples. Basilica at Revolution of 1989 Street, Tomis, today Constanța, Romania. This is to the left. And then Basilica number 6, Diocletianopolis, Extramuros. This is Hisaria in today's Bulgaria, to the right. Another example. This is Basilica C in Tropeum Traiani, or Adam Clisi, today's Romania. A very common type of crypt was the simple, small, box-like chamber under the altar. The church on the slide is in Bulgaria, near the town of Gabrovo, in a late antique fortress. You can see here, the crypt is very simple. The design is very simple. On the next slide, you can see 2 examples of small crypts devised in such way that the priests were able to make libation without taking the relics out. First crypt, the one to the left, is in the older space of the Episcopal Basilica in Odessos, Varna, Bulgaria. The second is under the altar table in the small basilica, part of the Episcopal complex in Nove Svishtov. So you can see that in both cases, the covers of the crypts were designed in such a way that you can make the libation there. Here on this reworked base from a column, and here you can see the opening next and under the base. This slab is the base of the altar table. Last two examples that I want to show you are in the basilica in the Kayaluka area near Varna, Bulgaria, and in a side chamber adjacent to Basilica B or C in the Yatros fortress near Krivina village, again in Bulgaria. In both cases, there are bases of tables with liturgical functions. More interesting are the holes in the middle of their upper side. It seems that these holes were not connected to the construction of the tables. They were normal legs. That's why we can assume that these holes were used to keep, for example, relics in them. This is, of course, just a hypothesis. Here you can see one of the holes to the left, in the middle. This is a reconstruction of the base. And in Yatros, you can see the base, and here the three small holes between the legs. All right, and now I will proceed to the second part of my presentation. It is much shorter, but I hope that it can inspire a discussion. A certain number of years ago, when I was working on my thesis, I collected information about all the churches in the Diocese of Thracia, in which there were any available archaeological data connected with the liturgical fittings and fixtures. Among other fittings and fixtures were the crypts. Naturally, I made a statistic, and the results were surprising. From around 230 early Christian churches, only in 125 there were any remains of liturgical fittings and fixtures. This was fine, but then only in 48 churches there were crypts of any kind. Excavations in the last few years after my study added some more sites and 4 or 5 more crypts to the lists, but it doesn't change these general observations. Of course, we should assume that in some cases, churches have been destroyed to such an extent that we just cannot expect to find any remains of crypts. We can even assume that in some cases, relics were kept under or in the altar tables or elsewhere in the church in a manner that after the destruction of the building, no traces could remain. This approach to the problem, though, is highly hypothetical, and it cannot lead to anything more than a mere speculation. Anyway, even with all that in mind, the difference in the numbers is striking. Archaeological evidence raises reasonable questions. Was it mandatory to have relics in every church? Was it a requirement to have them if you are going to dedicate a new church? And even, was it widely spread tradition, every congregation, to possess relics in the local church? Information that is available from the Middle Ages and from more recent periods confirm that there was a canonical requirement to have relics in every church that was about to be dedicated. However, what was the situation earlier in the period 4th to 6th century? At the church council in Carthage of 401 AD, it was decided that the relics should be used in the dedication of new churches. That rule, however, could hardly be applied to the Christian dioceses in the Roman East. Meanwhile, it was only in 787 when the council in Nicaea introduced the first rule of the same sort that applied strictly to the eastern half of the Christian world. These facts and observations were not mine. They were published by Anastasios Orlandos many years ago in the 50s of the 20th century. Unfortunately, the studies of this very prominent scholar are still almost unknown in Bulgaria because most of them were published only in Greek. If we compare the archaeological evidence with the historical data, it seems obvious that in the period 4th to 6th century AD, at least in the Diocese of Thracia, it was not mandatory to have relics in every church. Furthermore, that was not even necessarily common. One can expect that it was expensive and difficult to obtain relics, even if there were just small fragments. So probably this is the explanation. Of course, the business with fake relics was not invented in the Middle Ages, but certainly far earlier. However, maybe in the 4th and 6th century AD, it had not been completely developed as yet. So I have shared these observations and conclusions with some colleagues of mine, archaeologists, historians, and theologians. To my surprise, they were not convinced despite the statistics. Nevertheless, I still cannot find proof supporting an alternative hypothesis. In my opinion, today, we just transfer the medieval rules and practices to an earlier historical period, and I think that this is not correct. At least, this has not been supported by scientific evidence so far. I don't think that archaeology can help further, but I'm very curious if some information from historical or theological sources could help to solve this enigma. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I will do my best to answer now. Is there anybody out there?
Yes, we are here.
Yes.
Is there a moderator?
Yes.
Well, probably maybe Zotomira.
No,
Huh?
Alexander, you can be a moderator. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, can you hear me? Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. So now we can start with questions if somebody had such. By the way, thank you for your very interesting presentation. Like always, if I'm not wrong, at least third presentation to this project, more or less, maybe four even. I'm not sure.
I'm a regular member of the circle.
Yeah. Maybe I can start with one, not exactly question, maybe a comment. If I'm not wrong, I think that in Visa, today's Turkish town, Visa, no, sorry. There is some information for relics, but the main problem is that today the site is mosque and it's function like this, so it's not very known of the these relics, but actually I can send you more information, like the other site in Istanbul.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. By the way, that reminds me, Georgia Tanasov make a few topics about the crypts in Scythia Minor, like you show few examples from the province. So, do you agree with his opinion that there is some kind of certain points why there is so much crypts, and maybe not only this, exactly in this province? Can you make some kind of comment? And do you think it's connected with relics?
I don't really understand the question.
How can be more precise? I think that exactly the amount of so many crypts in province of Scythia indicate that there is, I don't know, maybe more saints or some kind of interest of this kind of yeah, I don't know. Yeah,
if I understand the question correctly,
yeah.
You want me to comment Professor Atanasov's studies on this topic?
Yes.
In general?
If you can, sorry. Yeah.
Well, first of all, this is one of the scholars in Bulgaria who deals with these problems. So I have to say that his studies are very useful, and he introduces some very interesting ideas. We have discussed some of these ideas with him also, and he focuses his attention in this region, of course. For sure, the number, statistically, the number of repositories for relics there is bigger than in the rest of the diocese. This is for certain. And another thing that is specific, that there is a very big number of big facilities, big crypts for whole bodies, as I said. And I think that Professor Atanasov actually is explaining this idea, this hypothesis that because it's a military zone, this is the border region, so the authorities, the Roman authorities, were more strict in the periods of persecutions. So there were more victims, more martyrs. And those holy men and women were buried there. So, how to put it, the Christian congregations in this region had access to more holy bodies than the congregations in the inner part of the diocese. This can explain first the number of crypts, and then the type, which is with the design is for whole bodies. And I think I said this in my presentation. In the rest of the diocese, there are some examples of crypts for whole bodies, but most of the examples are of crypts for small pieces. So you can imagine that the other Christians, they wanted to obtain relics, but they had access only to pieces, not to the whole bodies. There are some exceptions, of course, and usually the exceptions are around big cities. And there we can elaborate further on this topic. In the big cities, the authorities probably were more strict too, like in Philippopolis, for example. So I guess you want me to comment this question?
Not only because if I'm not wrong, before 2 years when we were in Yambo, he presents the Red Church near Peruștiță, and sorry, but my French is not good. He supposed that there is some kind of holiness of relics there. And by the way, not only there, also in Zaudapă, in church number 3 or 4, maybe 4. I'm not sure about the numeration. Yeah.
Well, this his presentation about Perushtica actually is in the same direction, let's say, because he tries to find the names of those martyrs that were executed near Philippopolis, and to connect these martyrs with the Red Church. So again, same thing, that because this is a very big center, so the local authorities were more strict in their work than Roman authorities in, let's say, in the countryside. But you know, I want to add here something else, which is again very interesting. If you study early Christian sites in northeastern Bulgaria and in the part of Dobruja that now is in Romania, so this is the lower Danubian limes. So in this region, it is interesting that there is like a shield of like a chain of very representative churches roughly along the limes, and with very high concentration of crypts with relics of saints. And it is interesting that even in small settlements, small fortresses, the churches are very, very monumental, very impressive. In some cases, we can think of some kind of funding from the big centers, or even from the imperial capital. And the question is why they built such a chain of expensive buildings, and why they made so many crypts for relics. So there is an opinion, hypothesis, that probably along with the military defense of the empire, the Eastern Roman Empire created a kind of spiritual line of defense. It sounds a little bit strange from our modern perspective, but if you have in mind the way of thinking and the connection between politics and theology in that period is not so incredible. So probably this is another explanation why they built so many big churches, and they put so many crypts with relics, because this is a kind of spiritual defense of the empire.
Yeah, you have a point actually, but yeah.
I personally I like this idea very much, but I have to know that this is not entirely my idea, because I discussed this with different colleagues, including with Professor Atanasov. So bit by bit, this idea just was created. So it's not my personal idea, but I like it very much, and I think that it's a reasonable idea.
Yep. Maybe it's important too when this relics was brought there. I mean, what if these relics was become part of exactly this church when actually the lower Danube province became one with three more province. I mean, what if this is some kind of really big building project, part of Questura Exercitus, for example? It's really important what is the date of these relics, and I mean when they was brought.
Yeah. By the way, here there is another interesting point. If we take the examples in Romania, they are very well studied, by the way, not only by Professor Atanasov, but by other scholars, Romanian scholars. Among them, I want to mention, Irina Achim from Bucharest, who's one of the specialists, modern specialists in this field. So it is interesting that there are a lot of big crypts for the bodies in big churches, but these constructions were relatively late.
Yeah.
I mean, in late antiquity, but relatively late. We're not talking about the time of Constantine, we're talking about later period. So this means that the churches were not built on top of existing graves. So this is not this kind of how to say primitive combination of grave and a church on top of it. These that probably are could be connected with the earlier period. But here we have a splendid churches, expensive constructions. We have crypts for like tombs for the bodies, but they are devised later in those settlements. So here we can see a kind of like a campaign to restore the holy places, to use the existing holy bodies that were there, but to build a new facility and put the bodies there. I explained this specifically because first thought would be that okay, we have whole bodies, we have graves, we have churches. Those were the cemeteries, so they just put churches on top of the graves. No, this was not the case in most of the sites. In fact, many of those churches in today's Romania are in the cities, intramuros, and not in the necropoli. So this is a later phase in the cult of relics. And again, I will go to this idea that at a certain point, probably because of the constant invasions, the empire wanted not only to reinforce the military line of defense, but to create a kind of spiritual line of defense there. And I really find this a fascinating idea.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Thank you for this really long, and thank you, by the way, for you helping me to explain my strange question. Thank you again.
There
any
is
other
a question
for
from
Lynn, maybe?
Yeah.
Sorry, I
Yeah.
can't find the little hand button thing that does it on the screen, so I'm just going to stick my hand up. It's not really a question, it's more a comment. You showed the little ivory placket from the reliquary in Trier earlier, and it's a little bit linked to what you guys were about, this idea of a spiritual line of defense and kind of the importance of having a relic somewhere. Because I think, you know, at the beginning, whenever you were introducing, you said, oh, this is maybe a slightly trivial subject, but for these people, this was extremely important. Like in the little placket, you can see all the people even climbing onto the roofs to see the delivery of this relic to the church. So it kind of boosts almost this idea of they really believe that this was something very important. So if this is how you treat just a small piece of a saint's bone arriving in Trier, imagine what it is to have on the line of defense of your entire country. So yeah, I think it's really fascinating idea. That's all.
Thank you.
By the way, I'm presenting this topic from the point of view of archaeology, of course, because I'm an archaeologist. But historians can provide very interesting records describing the way early Christians were venerating relics. I have read some of those published by different authors, and it is extremely interesting because from our modern perspective, all this is very strange, very exotic, but obviously not. It is proven because there is a lot of historical evidence. The early Christians and then the medieval Christians, for them, relics, this part of the devotion, Christian devotion, was extremely important.
Well, that reminds me that the relics on Saint Ivan across the ancient Zoopolis, and even the modern one. Yeah. Any other questions? Nikolai Sharanko, please.
First of all, I would like to congratulate Vassil for this very nice presentation, and I would like to add a comment concerning the hagiographical sources, which I think corresponds to the statistics he made about the absence of crypts in many churches. If we read the lives of early Christian martyrs, especially those which we can consider genuine or reliable, we see that there are almost no comments about the bodies of these saints or of any cult of their holy relics. So probably this lack of information in the lives of the martyrs corresponds to the lack of crypts in many churches. Because in other places, in lives of saints connected with other places, there is almost always rich information about the burials of these saints, of transfers of relics. But in the early lives of Christian martyrs from the Diocese of Thrace, especially in the southern part, there is almost no information about that.
Thank you. Thank you, Nikolai.
Thank you. Any other questions? Nikolai, please lower your hand if it's possible. Maybe, thank you. Maybe Andrea Piutz can make some comments, or any others? We have opportunity to listen.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Yep. Yep.
May I only, first of all, wonderful presentation. Thank you, Vassil. I was wondering about the translation of the relics. I had some problems with my internet, so I didn't hear all, but perhaps you spoke about. Do you know, are there a lot of written sources telling about the import coming from Constantinople, or the other way around? Are there sources telling about an export, so that we know that in Constantinople, I do not know if there are some saints coming from Thracia or not. But perhaps you told them, I didn't hear it, you know.
Well, I focus on the archaeological evidence because I'm not a specialist in the sources. As far as I know, there are no many. There is no much information about saints from our lands, from Bulgarian lands, or the diocese in general.
Yeah.
Mostly, we have names from the how to pronounce it, martyrologists.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I don't think that there is much information about that. But for example, if Nikolai knows more, he can comment this too.
Yeah. So there are more local saints which are venerated.
This is difficult to say because we almost in almost no case we have names of saints. There are one or two exceptions in Scythia.
Yeah.
And there are some names written in the crypts. There is one exception in near Varna, most in fact from Marcianopolis. And what else? We even usually don't know the names of the church.
Okay. And another question, sorry to continue now. Do you have special vessels which you found, yeah, let's say in the nearer or in the vicinity of the churches or of the relics? You know, this ampulla, like we know from Minas or the Asia Minor type, or from the Holy Land. Do you have any indication that pilgrims had the possibility to take some tokens or something like this from their pilgrimage back to home?
It's a very interesting question. In fact, we don't have enough archaeological information about this. We have, at least in Bulgarian sites, we have from time to time small vessels found for holy oil, but in those cases the vessels were imported from somewhere else.
Okay.
So there were not a local production. I don't know of any local production of such objects. Sometimes we find also other objects like souvenirs from other sites, like from Odessus, from Janavara monastery, but not only. We have already found several fibulae, bronze fibulae, with the name Minas, Saint Minas.
Okay.
Obviously, they were not from Odessus because the cult is not local. So we think that those were imported. Probably some pilgrims from Odessus went to his shrine and took them. But it's a really interesting question. I wonder whether we couldn't identify some objects as ampullae for holy oil. Because we think of those objects as something with a symbol or a name or an image, but they could be with very simple design, I guess. But for now, we don't have, how to say, undoubtable information about this.
Okay, thank you.
And I haven't heard of such information from Romania too.
If you allow me to add some information, if I'm not wrong, from Serdica at present-day Sofia, there is some ampulla, if I'm not wrong, from the excavations of metro station number 8. But I'm not the specialist about it. It was published by Mario Ivanov in Archaeological, but I can send you more information if you need such.
The question here, Alex, is whether these ampullae were imported to Serdica from somewhere else.
Probably.
Or they were produced in Serdica and contained oil from some of the local holy places. So this is interesting to make the connection with the site.
Yeah, probably this one in Serdica, it's from private, it's from domestic houses, from private houses. So probably it's brought. It's not. I don't know. We don't have any clues to local produce yet.
May I go back to this picture? Just a second. The existence of these two sites, these two facilities in the Episcopal Basilica in Odessus and in the small basilica in Nove, they were made to make libation.
Yeah.
And there at least in Varna, there was a way to collect the oil, because in the case of the small basilica, you see the reconstruction. It would be difficult to take the oil back. So here you have just libation, like a ritual. But in Odessus, you have two small chambers. You see, the one of them was covered with this base, and there was here a cavity and a small channel. And there was another chamber here, it was open. So we can assume that the oil was poured on the base, and then through this channel, it was running into the other. It should be collected in something, in some vessel. So this is not a direct evidence, but at least some evidence that people produced holy oil. So it was set in some kind of vessel, and that vessel could be distributed as ampoule, as an evlogia.
Okay.
We don't have any vessels preserved that could be connected with this, but if you have the device to collect oil, we can assume that some vessels were used.
Well, this idea of drinking water that's been blessed there, like in the church, oil, well, maybe oil, but wine or water, something like that as well. Maybe I don't know.
We know from Asia Minor or from Constantinople or Patonia, I don't know. It's on the west to Constantinople. There are a lot. They found a lot of these in Roman ceramics. It's these unguentaria, this special kind of little flasks. They are very often stamped with monograms, and there is this big discussion if these stamps they can be connected to bishops or not bishops, and if this has something to do with the church or not. But they are very common, these flasks, and I do not know. Do you know which kind of flask I mean with these unguentaria? Yeah, and you do not have them in Bulgaria as well?
Well, we have them, but as far as I know, they are without stamps on them.
Okay.
Or if there are stamps, they are not connected with the church's life.
Yeah. Now this is only a theory. Yeah, it's not proven that.
From vessels, we have a lot of vessels like this.
Yeah.
But not found in the context of a church.
Yeah, and this is.
And now I'm thinking probably some of them were in the context of a church, but because to make excavation in Odessos is an adventure because the layers are like this, and probably we just have missed some of this, or we have misinterpreted them. Anyway, we haven't found objects like this in a clear archaeological context.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Any other questions? Please, don't be shy. Well, if it's not, I think no. So thank you very much for this wonderful presentation.
You're welcome.
Well, what can I say? Good luck to each and every one of you, and I hope to see each other again.
Yeah, for the next lecture.
For the next lecture. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Okay.
Vassil. Thank you, Alex. Thank you both of you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.
Have a nice
evening. Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye.